Thank you very much. Yeah, so I would like to continue from where Christina has taken us to, and now talk about what the science says about wildfires. So my name is Guillermo Rein. I'm professor of fire science at Imperial College, just here in London, in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. So in this part two, I would like to have an appreciation of the complexity of wildfire behavior. It is a monster of its own, and it is difficult to actually understand what it's going to do next. So we will try to split the behavior. We know that there are three main components to explain wildfire behavior. The first one is fuel, then is topography, and then is wind. And we will look into what the science says regarding each of these three components. And we will do this specifically through going the science that I know about, which is a science that explains the process of combustion and ignition spread, and then we'll finish with the smoke. Yeah, sorry, I'm just moving this away. Perfect. So just to start with, what is fire science? So obviously this is the science, the branch of science that studies fires. Itself, what it does is creates new knowledge, new ways of understanding, new methodologies, and that's what I do for about half of my professional life. But that itself, just creating new knowledge, is necessary, but it's not sufficient. There is a need to transfer that knowledge to society, particularly through the world of through professionals like the fire brigade and engineers and other personnel. Transfer that knowledge to them so they can combine this new knowledge with previous knowledge and with previous devices and previous methodologies, such that something new can take place. And then this new thing would be better thanks to the knowledge. So that's the role of science, is not to stop at the knowledge, is to go across and transfer that knowledge. And together, what we want to do is to protect people, property, and the environment. So, and in that order. So protecting people is by far the single most important task, but also we want to protect the property, and we also want to protect the environment. We want to do all of it. When we want to protect people and property and the environment, we talk about impact. I want to show this slide. It's an image from what is happening in California. California, for the last 10 years, has been every summer in the news because the size of the problem that is facing in California is very scary, and this can be measured in many ways. It can be measured by the number of wildfires, by the number of kilometers square of wildfire that is burning, by the people that is evacuating. We can, by the fire brigade cost, but we can also look into this by the amount of money that the insurance company have to pay to people who have lost their homes. And we're talking about billions per year. Several billions per year of wildfires entering into rural communities and burning homes and infrastructure and buildings. And this is an example of what we want to avoid. In California, they are quite good at protecting life. There are very few fatalities, just very good, from wildfires, but they're not very good in the sense of the wildfire behavior they're experiencing it cannot be stopped before it reaches rural communities. When we look into wildfire behavior all around the world, we very often, unfortunately, have to use the word of unprecedented. When we look into the best database, the best historical database of wildfire behaviors in the United States, it can go much soon. It can be much farther away than 1985, but I want to show you this data. Christina has referred to this data already. So this is from 1985 to the year 2015. It's a famous plot. What it's showing you is in blue is the number of wildfires. So you see the United States over those 20 years. It was, actually 30 years. It was not seen a significant increase in the number of wildfires, but it's quite meaningless to talk about the number of wildfires. What actually matters is the impact of these wildfires. The impact of the wildfires can be measured in different ways, as we're going to discuss. One of the approximations to look into the impact is how big they were, because the bigger they are, the higher the chances of them destroying and affecting different things. So that's the black curve over here. And that one, you can see that historically, over the course of these 30 years, the fires are getting bigger because the area burn is larger, the number of wildfires is about the same, which means that United States, across the whole continental United States, is seeing historically and continues being that more of the big wildfires. And we worry a lot about wildfires, but we worry even more about the large ones, because these are the ones that truly lead to disasters. This is not just United States. This happened in every single database that I know about that people care about life and property. If we only care about the environment, if we only care about the damage to the ecosystem, is debatable. And people say, well, we don't see that many fires that are destroying the ecosystem. But when people care about protecting life and property and infrastructure, which is the fires that are entering into rural communities, the number of wildfires is unprecedented. Take into account also that any fire can also damage the ecosystem, because they might happen with a frequency that is too high or an intensity that is too high. And that the only reason why we are seeing this unprecedented behavior is not just climate change. Climate change is one of the three main factors that are changing wildfire behavior. Is one that currently most people are interested about. There is a very high intense interest in climate change. So climate change is one of the changes that is changing wildfire behavior, but there are also changes in the land use and the population around the communities and the forest where this is happening. So we cannot associate everything that happens to climate change. We have to spend time into seeing what each of these changes is affecting each of the countries. For example, in the UK, we do have a very clear signal of climate change, because although there are population changes, these are not dramatic, or not as dramatic as the increase of wildfire behavior that we are seeing in the UK. And there are changes in land use, but they are not as dramatic as the climate change, as the wildfire behavior. An example of a region of the world where these three signals untangle together, and there is only one of them, is the Arctic. In the Arctic, there are no changes in land use. No one is in the Arctic doing anything to land. It's pretty much untouched forest and wilderness. There are no changes in the population. The amount of people in the Arctic is really, really small, and changes are even smaller. So the only change that is happening in the Arctic over the last many years is climate change. And we do see an unprecedented wildfire behavior in the Arctic. So that's why there is an interest in the Arctic, even for people like me who care about fire safety. We look into the Arctic to learn what is climate change doing in a place where only climate change is one of the factors. And then we try to bring that to other places around the world where it is not just climate change, it's other things that are happening. So I said the main objective is to understand impact of these wildfires. We want to minimize this impact, and the way we quantify the impact is through what we call fire severity. Is how severe, how bad was the damage that the fire produced. We can measure this in many different ways. It's a science topic by itself, how to measure fire severity. But in general terms, what we're looking into how much vegetation was lost because it got involved in the fire, how much of vegetation got charred, and how much was the heat penetrated in different parts of the forest. We want to do this because if we know the fire severity, we start to get closer to understand societal impacts, like what is the loss of life, the loss of property, and the suppression cost. And also we look into the impact that it has in the ecosystem, the changes in the landscape, erosion, and if it's going to be recovery or not. So with this, what I want to tell you is that it's very important to understand fire severity. However, there is a quantity, there is a phenomena that expresses fire severity, which is the origin of fire severity, is the mother of fire severity, which is fire intensity. So although in reality we want fire severity is in a large fraction explained by fire intensity. And fire intensity is the size of the fire itself. We can refer to the power, the thermal power of a fire, or the length of the fire line, or maybe the height of the flames, or how fast the fire is moving. All these quantities are different ways of looking at the fire intensity, and all of them matter. If we understand fire intensity, we can actually understand fire severity. If we minimize fire intensity, we are minimizing fire severity. And that is the relationship between the two of them. So some fields of science and some fields of emergencies, people talk about severity a lot. And I just want to make a case for the importance of understanding the intensity that allows us to go forward with severity. So when we look into wildfires, and already Christina has shown this, and I'm going to show you a little bit more, there are all these scales that people use to understand wildfire behavior. So we could, the fire is here at the bottom in this sketch. That's the actual flames. That's the actual forest that is burning with a scar burn, burn scar, and the forest that so far has not burned. And we could be looking at this from the point of view of the animals and the trees that are in the forest that's very close to the flame, or the fire brigades, which are typically the humans are the closest to the fire, fighting and being there, attending the emergency. Or farther away, we may be talking about someone that is in a fire watch, looking into the landscape and seeing the plume of smoke. Or maybe we're talking about someone that is in a helicopter or even a drone that is observing the fire from farther away. And we're getting far and farther away, maybe a community that can see the fire burning over the hill. And then at the farthest distance, without leaving the planet Earth, without going to the moon, would be satellites. The satellites see the fire. Maybe they are the farthest away from the fire, but they have a wide reach. They can see a much wider region. They have an overview of a phenomena which cannot be matched by the other methods. Whereas the closer we get, we have a higher spatial resolution. We understand more of the smaller scale phenomena, but we don't have the reach that the satellite gives us. With this, what I want to say is that all scales matter and all scales are needed to understand wildfire behavior. And if one of these scales is missing for whatever the reason, then our understanding of the emergency, our understanding of the process would be incomplete. So this is a call for bringing all the scales, integrating together. I'm going to give you an example of the two scales, extremes. This is an image from a satellite. We could not get farther from this wildfire without leaving planet Earth. It's provided by NASA, and it is actually a fire that Christina has already talked to you about. It's in 2018, the Saddleworth fire. It was a big fire. It concerned a lot UK authorities and emergency personnel. And in this image, gives you a broad reach of the phenomena. You can identify a conundrum. This is the fire. You can see the fire is over here. It's propagating. This is the fire, the burn scar. So the fire is propagating in this particular moment against the wind, because the part that is already the wind is actually already burned. And you can see that the fire, the wind is bringing the plume and the toxicity and the smoke into a population of Stanley Bridge. That it is concerning because it actually led to some people being evacuated, some schools being closed, elderly being asked not to go into the street, people to be indoors and to be aware that the air they will be breathing for the next several hours and days, it is toxic, and they have to be careful with this. At the same time, that will be social impact. At the same time, the fire is propagating towards the moor over here, which is a beautiful ecosystem. So the fire brigade at this point has to decide some resources will have to go to help this community. Some resources will have to go and protect the ecosystem. And obviously what we want is, and what they wanted to do was to get rid of a fire and stop it as soon as possible. But in this image, you see impact to the environment and impact to society, and the smoke doing one thing and the fire, the flames doing the other. And you can see this reached by satellite imaging. The same way we can go to the other extreme. We actually go to the closest scale to the fire. This is a handheld camera. I think it was actually Dr. Stacy News who took this photo after the fire. It's very close, so you can actually see this is about what you would see from your handheld device if you were in the place. What you can see is the grass in the back. You can see that the soil has been charred, but now it has not. So many of the fuel has not burned itself. But what you can see is that this rim has been produced. This is because the soil that is black is actually peat, is rich in carbon, is dry, is flammable, and it is burning, and it's slowly burning 1 bit per hour by smoldering without a flame. And you can see that after it is consumed, there is a missing of about 20 centimeters of the soil are gone, and then it's covered by ash. And these 20 centimeters of soil is carbon stored by nature in peat. Peat is a beautiful ecosystem, quite important for the UK. And now this has burned without a flame and is in the atmosphere, and it has led to a carbon footprint and destroy a beautiful ecosystem. And This is smoldering. You will not be able to see it in the satellite. Satellite will be absolutely blind to see a smoldering. And it's a process that doesn't happen at the same time as the emergency. This is a process that could happen days and weeks after the emergency. And it's a different scale in space, but it's also a different scale in time. So let's call for combustion science to help us. The first thing that combustion science will help us is that when we talk about wildfires, there are many different types and behaviors, but we can classify these into three categories immediately. Crown fires are burning the top of the trees. It is a very concerning type of fire, leads to the biggest and fastest fires known to humanity. Because there is an incredible amount of fuel that is up in the trees, steam fuel. We'll describe later on why this is important. This doesn't happen often in the UK, and we are very lucky for that we are not too concerned about crown fires. The one that happens more often, particularly in the UK, are surface fires. This is when the fuel, the vegetation that is burning is the grass, the litter, and the shrubs that are happening in the land. These are fires that can be fast, but at least the flames would be dictated by the amount of fuel, and it will affect the trees, but maybe it's not affecting the top of the trees. And then ground fires, which is what the soil itself is burning. We're talking about the peat, the humus layer, and the duff layer. And these are often fires that are not with a flame, they are flameless, they are smoldering. And they propagate really slowly, but they produce most of the emissions, and most of the smoke actually is produced from ground fires. So in the UK, surface fires and ground fires happen with the highest frequency, and ground fires less. The behavior of each of these is very different, and science will associate different characteristics to each of them. Science can also tell us, combustion science can also tell us what is a flame. So just very quickly, a flame is a region of space, very thin region of space. I use a candle here to exemplify, where the fuel that comes from the degradation of the wax meets the oxygen. So they literally meet there, and where they meet, that's where the edge of the flame is produced. The inside of the flame is full of fuel, and the outside of the flame is full of air, in particular carrying the oxygen. And then this flame will react. There will be a reaction at the flame. This reaction is exothermic. It releases a significant amount of energy in the form of heat. It is, in fact, so much heat that it reaches its temperature and it starts to create its own light. That's why flames are seen by the naked eye. This is why we use flames for a long time to give us light, because they are so hot, they produce their own light. But shortly after, fractions of a second after they are so hot that they emit that light, they move up, they leave the flame, and they cool, and they stop emitting their own light. And when that happens, we call it a smoke. And also chemical reactions, or at least fast chemical reactions, have stopped. So that is smoke. So what is smoke? Smoke is what a fraction of a second before was the flame itself. So it's what is left of the combustion process that once upon a time was releasing energy. It's not just about the flame. As I said before, smoldering, flameless combustion is very important. In particular, in the UK, it's important not just because of pit fires, but it's also very important for what is called residual burning. Residual burning is when the flames come in and they start to burn thin fuels. Then when the flame ends, that's not the end of the combustion process. You can see it over here. Flames are propagating towards the left of the screen, but most of the smoke is coming from this region over here. Most of the smoke by far is coming from where the flames are not. And that is because the fuel is burning, not with a flame, is burning with a smoldering. And this is what they call residual burning. They call it residual burning because their attention is on the flame. Yet, however, the emissions and the damage to the ecosystem and the potentially for this fire to rekindle and to ignite again is on the smoldering. And also fire brands, which is a topic of increasing interest, and because it's a hazard where fires can actually start in different places at long distances because of the little pieces of wood, little pieces of biomass that are glowing, that are smoldering, can fly with the wind and with the plume and land in different locations and start new fires. So these pit fires, residual burning, and fire brands, the three of them are a smoldering phenomena that we are concerned about. So now we call for for science to help us and say something about the three elements. So when we talk about fuel, we're going to discuss in the next few minutes the importance of the thickness of the fuel to know if it's live or it's dead fuel, and the moisture. When we look into topography, we're going to see the importance of a slope. And when we talk about wind, we will be talking about the direction of the wind and the velocity. And because of the importance of fuel, topography, and wind, this is why we talk about weather, fire weather, and why we call, and that's why this course is being given by the Met Office with the Met Office, because weather has an overwhelming presence in these three components. The only component that the weather doesn't say anything about is topography, the slope. But the wind direction and velocity is part of the weather system, and the moisture of the fuel, which is so important, we're going to see that in a few minutes, is also given by the weather, not the weather of the day, but the weather of the last few days and weeks. So there is an importance in understanding the weather because it explains actually more than half of the three main components that explain wildfire behavior. Now, is the weather enough? No. Knowing the weather of the future, the present, and the past is not enough to understand or to explain wildfire behavior, but it explains a significant amount of it. So let's look into ignition. When we look into ignition, we very quickly realize that not all fuels are the same, and it's not about the species, it's not about the color, it's not about the type of fuel that we are seeing. Is the first thing is the thickness of the fuel. And when we say thickness, we actually mean thermal thickness. So it's the thickness that the heat transfer will see. Now that's a little bit too complex, although fascinating to explain. But then people have come out with a physical thickness that explains it. So if the fuel, when we take it in our hands, if the thinnest part of this fuel is below 6 millimeters in diameter or equivalent diameter, then we classify that fuel as thin fuels. For example, leaves of the tree, needles, grass, twigs, and most of the surface litter that stays on the soil. If it is more than 6 millimeters, then we call them coarse fuels, like most branches and logs, snags, the tree trunks, and the soil itself, the soil layer. That's quite thick and it's coarse. Why do we make this distinction? This is fundamental. The first one is that if a fuel is thin, everything happens fast. The fuel dries fast, so it is able to catch up with the weather. It is raining, well, it will immediately get moisture. If it's dry, well, immediately will dry. The thin fuels react very quickly to any change. They will also ignite very quickly. So when the flames are arriving on where there is an ignition source, the first fuel that will ignite are not the thick fuels at all, are the thin fuels. They are the first ones to ignite. And when they're burning, they burn quickly. They ignite quickly and they disappear quickly because they are thin. Whereas the coarse fuels will do literally the opposite. Because they react so fast to everything that is happening, thin fuels tend to be present, it's burning, at the front of the fire line, and they dictate the flame spread. So if a fire is fast or slow, it is down to the amount of thin fuels that are present in the fuel, in the forest. Whereas with thick fuels, they dry, they ignite, and they burn slowly. And the thicker they are, the slower all these processes would be. So for example, if the weather changes suddenly, the thick fuels, the coarse fuels, don't realize about the changes just yet. They require another few days until they start to really change their moisture according to the weather. And when they ignite slowly. The ignition source or the flames have to be there for longer. And when they burn, they might burn for half an hour, they might burn for several hours, they could burn for several days, as it happens with the smoldering. Because of these characteristics, they typically are present at the back of the fire line, whereas the thin fuels are at the front line, the thick fuels, the coarse fuels are at the back of the fire line. And they have very little effect on the spread rate, but they do have a significant effect on the thickness of the fire line and for how long the fire would be in any single location. The examples that Christina has mentioned to you, these are UK type of ecosystems, and you can immediately look into the photos, and next time you go to the forest, you can start to classify how much of the fuel is thin, less than 6 millimeters, and how much of the fuel is thick. So for example, here, when you see the heather, most of the heather is thin fuels. They are beautiful ecosystems. These three over here will have significant parts of it that are thick, but it's the only one. most of the heather it is thin. The soil itself, if it's flammable because it has a high content of carbon, that would be a thick fuel, it would be coarse. Or woodlands, where you start to significantly have an amount of thick fuels and some thin fuels that are far above in the crowns. And the same goes with bracken and gore. So there is a significant amount of thin fuels in the UK, and there is two main thick coarse fuels in the UK, which are the tree trunks and the peat itself in the soil. Now let me show you how fire science studies the flammability of different materials. It's not just about the thickness, which we already discussed. What other quantities matter to fire science? And the way we do this is we study the ignition process of these fuels. For example, we can put this as an example where we study pine needles. We take a basket of pine needles, and we put this basket under a very intense source of heat. This is the sketch over here. This is heat that arrives to the pine needles, and the pine needles start to heat up, and at some point they ignite and they start to burn. So what we do is that different fuels will take different times to ignite. And obviously, as we make the heat source more intense, this is what we say heat flux. Heat flux will be a lot of heat coming from the heat source. A lower heat flux will be less heat coming from the heat source. Of course, it takes different time to ignite. Heat source is small, it takes longer to ignite. It still ignites, but it takes longer. It takes longer to ignite. And if the heat source is very high, it takes just seconds, right? For example, this fuel over here will ignite in about 100 seconds. So that's about 2 minutes if the heat flux is in the order of 25 kilowatts per meter square, whereas it would take about 10 seconds to ignite if it were to be 100. So the difference between igniting in 10 seconds or igniting in 2 minutes is very dramatic. And this will be the same fuel depending on the heat flux. So what we do is we fix the heat flux. We say we fix the heat flux typically a quantity of about 40 kilowatts per meter square. And then we see how different fuels ignite and the time that it takes them to ignite. For example, this is an a study that we conducted where we look into the flammability of fuels that are dead, pine needles that are brown, the same type of pine needles that live, they are green, and then the same type of pine needles that we brought into the lab and we left them in the lab for a very long time, and they age and they naturally die in the lab. Well, we didn't naturally die, we probably killed them ourselves. But what I mean is that when we collect them from the forest, they were alive, and then in the lab under the storage conditions over several weeks, they became dead. Whereas the dead fuels over here, they were already dead when we collect them. And this is the time to ignition to each of them. This is live needles, aged needles, and dead needles. And you immediately see that live needles took about 60 seconds to ignite. That's way more than the time that the aged and dead needles took, which was more like 15 seconds. So in this graph already you see the importance of knowing not only just the thickness of the species of the tree, the needles, to know what is there, if they are alive or if they are dead. Because if they are dead, they have really fast response to fire and they ignite very quickly. And if they're alive, they have an inbuilt mechanism, the cell nature. Cells are full of water, so the fuel itself can protect a little bit more against fire, and they take longer, about 5 times longer to ignite. So it's very important when you see in the forest a lot of dead fuel in the tree because the tree is dead, or in the bush or in the soil, that is more flammable than if the fuel is alive and healthy. It's not only that it takes shorter to ignite, it's also that when it ignites and we are looking into the amount of heat that they release, we see that dead fuels release more energy per gram of mass that they have, whereas the live fuels, they release less energy per mass that they have. So it's not only that they ignite faster, it's that they release more heat and they lead to bigger fires if they are dead versus if they are alive. This is what fire science tells us. Fire science can also help us to understand the spread, not just the ignition or the flammability of different fuels, but how all this combines and tells us. So when you look into a real wildfire, this is a sketch from a very famous book of a real wildfire. You have the head part of the wildfire, you have the rear part of the wildfire, and you have the flanks. And then you have this very complex phenomena where you can have pockets, you can have fingers, you can have islands, and you can have spot fires, right? Look into the shape of this fire. This is the origin. You can see that the wind was in the direction towards the right. And because of the wind being in the direction of the right, that's where the head fire is elongated, whereas the rear perimeter is much closer to the origin. This is because of the wind. So we can look into this, and we can look into the role of wind and other parameters. So the spread of a wildfire is dictated by the speed at which heat can transfer from the flame to the fuel ahead. The speed of this transfer is either by convection, which would be the smoke, the hot smoke, getting into contact with the fuel and transferring some of this thermal energy and preheating the fuel, or it could be by radiation, in the sense of the flames are very high temperature, that they produce their own light, and they also radiate thermal energy that can actually find other fuels, and they will preheat them as well. And the third one is what we call flame contact, which is the flame itself is touching the fuels, and actually is the highest speed of transferring of heat, flame contact. And in reality, the three of them combine together to explain the rate of a spread. The most important thing is that the closer the fuel is to the flames, the faster is going to be the spread. And the farther away the fuel is from the flames, the slower is going to be the spread to that location. And we're going to discuss now in this context the effect of moisture and wind. So this is a very famous plot where it shows you different spread rates measuring experiments, spread rate, so this is the speed at which it's moving in centimeters per second, as a function of the moisture of the fuel. So the moisture of the fuel is the amount of water that it has, right? So it could be very low moisture, or it could be very high moisture. And all this happens in nature. Nature is changing the moisture of the fuels with the weather. If it's wet, it will increase the moisture over the time that the moist is there. If it's dry, it will actually dry the moisture. That's why we talk about heat waves, because they dry the fuel. And what they do is they go from a fuel that maybe have 30% water content, it actually can go down to 10% water content. And when it does happen, look the effect that it has on the spread rate. Much faster fires if it's dry, much lower fires if it's wet. So with this plot, I want to highlight the importance of knowing the moisture of the fuel, because the same fuel, the same species, the same thickness, dead or alive, the moisture that it has is very important to explain the speed at which the fire will propagate. And we are very concerned if it's dry. We are still concerned, but less concerned if it's wet. If the fuel is alive, it has an inbuilt mechanism by the mechanism of the cells to maintain its moisture, and it's not just dictated by the weather, it's dictated by the weather and life of the plant. But if the fuel is dead, it has lost the ability to regulate. There is no such a thing as a cell that is active, they're all dead. And then dead fuels are at the mercy of the weather, and the moisture is explained largely by the weather. Not only just the moisture, this is an effect of the slope. We discussed that the slope is one of the three parameters that cannot be explained by weather. So we can see here its effect. And what we can see is that this is the slope measured in alpha, in degrees alpha, the slope with the horizontal. And we can see that as we increase the inclination upwards, the flame in spread rate increases, and there is a point above 20 degrees that is not that it increases, is that it increases exponentially. And we see that the fastest fires are the ones that are more inclined towards the vertical. Whereas we see that the fires that are inclined downwards, with the inclination that is going downwards, they are slower than if they were to be flat with a 0 degrees inclination, but they are not that much lower than flat. So what we say is that the slope has a very high intensity effect if it's upwards, but if it's downwards, the slope is just a mild effect, not a massive effect. You can see this, how I explain this to my kids with little drawings of flames going upwards, flat, and downwards. And this is how I want to explain to you why it's faster going upwards. The distance between the flame, that always is vertical because it's looking for, because of buoyancy, for the gases, and the flame itself are lower density than the surrounding air. So they always know where the vertical is. The vertical flame and the upslope fuel, they're very close to each other compared to the distance that exists between the flame that is vertical and the downward fuel, which they have a much longer distance. Because the distance between the fuel and the flame is larger, the downward spread heat transfer is slower, and therefore the spread is slower, and upwards is faster. So whenever you see a wildfire and you're trying to avoid the wildfire, you should be looking up to the fire, such that the fire has to propagate downwards to you. That's the slowest. If you're looking down to the fire and the fire is propagating upwards to you, you should be concerned, because that's the fastest speed that the fire has is towards you. And then the last effect that I want to show you with this graph is a little bit more messy, but it's a historical graph, is the effect of wind. As the wind increases in magnitude, the spread rate increases tremendously. And you can see that the thinner the fuel, the even more the effect that it has on wind. And the thicker the fuel, it still has an effect, the wind has an effect on it, but it's not as much as it were to be thin. So wind not only dictates the direction of the spread, it also accelerates the spread rate of the fire in that direction tremendously. Why? Because it inclines the flame, and it actually takes the smoke and the flame itself towards the near fuels, and they actually even let into flame contact, which is the fastest spread that we can think of. This is the effect of the wind. Now I want to show you very quickly how all this complexity of moisture and thickness and being dead or alive and wind can actually be brought together. So science has helped us to understand them separately, but there is this model developed in the US, the Rothermel model of 1972. This was before I was born. It's a model that actually, with this equation that you can see over there, that I can bring all the effects together. And I'll show you this in these sketches. So this is, you're looking into a fire from the top. It's a model that we did. It's not a real fire. We ignite where the X is, and this is our 4 quadrants. Each of the quadrants has dry fuel, wet fuel, dry fuel, wet fuel. And then you can see the isochrons, or where the wildfire is at different times. And you can see immediately that the fire is propagating really fast in the dry, and it's propagating very slowly in the wet, because the distance between the isochrons is very small. It's a fire that is propagating very slowly. Distance between isochrons being large is a fire that is spreading very fast. It showed you the effect of moisture. In the next one, we can see the effect of a slope. There is a valley, we ignite at the bottom, and there is one slope is going up with a degree of 5 degrees inclination, and the other one is 15 degrees inclination. We ignite and we let the fire propagate in a fire simulation. Where is the fastest spread? Upwards through the slope of 15 degrees. Where is the slowest spread? Upwards through the slope of 5 degrees. And then we can see the effect of the wind. We ignite here, and there is a wind that is going towards the bottom of the slide. Obviously, the fastest spread is happening in the direction of the wind, and the slowest is happening in the rear against the wind. It still happens against the wind, but it's much slower than in the front. And then we can combine the two. We can combine them all. It comes with this mess, which is real behavior. Those of you who have experienced close or far away actual behavior of a wildfire, it is very complex to understand what's going on. Wind is changing, different fuels everywhere, different moistures, different slopes. But this is a little bit of explaining the mess. So if we were to have a fire in the center, and there is dry fuel, wet fuel, wet fuel, there is wind going downwards, and we are at the bottom of a valley, and this branch towards the left is at 15 degrees, and this one to the right is 5 degrees, we end up with almost no spread whatsoever in this quadrant, because everything is against. We end up with massive spread in this quadrant because everything is helping it, and we end up in half-half cases of intermediate spread in the other 2 quadrants, because some of the factors are promoting fastest spread, some of the other factors are not explaining spread. So this, I want to show you how everything comes together. And then the last slide is about smoke. There are 2 main types of fires. I've discussed this with you already: flaming with flames and smoldering. The smoke from flames has a tendency to be dark black, dark gray, because it contains soot, which are little particles of carbon that can be produced only by flames. These flames are very high temperature because they are more exothermic. Therefore, the plume is high temperature. That makes it very buoyant. So it's a plume that knows where the vertical is and tends to go up into the vertical, and it can actually go high up into the atmosphere. Whereas smoldering not only is a different type of combustion, it also leads to a very different type of smoke. This smoke is whitish, light gray, even yellowy sometimes. And because the smoldering is not as hot as the flame, the plume that it produces is not immediately going to the vertical. It's a plume that doesn't know where up and down is, and it actually creates this haze that goes across. It stays attached to the ground, doesn't go up, and it moves slightly with the wind, left or right, wherever the wind is. This smoke, it actually doesn't have soot, so that's why the color changes, but it has a high level of toxicity. Actually, it's more toxic even than the smoke from flames, because it includes a lot of incomplete products of combustion. So now when you look into a fire, you probably will see that the two colors are combined, the dark gray and the lighter gray. That is indicating you to the source of the combustion process that is producing this. And very often you can actually identify the residual burning, because you will see the flames moving, producing the black smoke, and behind where the flames stop, but it's smoldering, you have the white smoke, and then the black smoke that is buoyant entrains the white smoke, and then you have a combination between a vertical plume and the haze together, lofting up the emissions. So with this, I finish, just to tell you about the concerns that there exist in the UK and the importance of protecting people, property, and ecosystems. That wildfire behavior is complex and a mess, but there is these three main components: field, topography, and wind, that allows us to understand the most important parts of it. That the spread rate increases with the wind. It also increases with the slope and decreases with the moisture and the field thickness. And that weather is so important because it affects the moisture, which affects the fuel and affects the wind. So it's almost more than half of the components that matter mostly to wildfire spread. And that the worst that we could be prepared for is a forest or an ecosystem that has fine fuels that are dead and dry while they're burning upslope on a windy day. These are the fastest fires and the most concerning fires, and it cannot get worse than this. And with this, I finish. Thank you very much.